Hey ghouls and gals, welcome back to my channel. My name is Taylor and today's vlog is going to be my Love Bites vlog, a vampire vlog just in time for Valentine's Day week. I love horror fiction, so when I am choosing books to read for my February TBR and kind of planning out some themed books, some themed reading for Valentine's Day, my mind as a horror fiction lover goes to vampires and Gothic fiction books that could work for a Valentine's Day theme. Vampires are just like very passionate creatures, whether they are vampires that are very romantic and idealized and conventionally attractive like Anne Rice vampires, or perhaps they're not so much conventionally attractive. I know there are people who will put them on a hear me out cake, but you know, we also have our Nosferatus as well. Either way though, vampires are so intertwined with passion and desire and romance, so I figured why not have a vampire reading vlog for this week leading up into Valentine's Day. Now, I did pick 4 different books with 4 very different takes on vampires, and then just also the different vampire relationships, because while vampires are so passionate, like they're passionate beings, that doesn't necessarily mean that a vampire book is going to be romance heavy. Now, sure, the very foundations of the genre, how vampires traditionally have been very intertwined and interlinked with Gothic horror, we do see romance plots or passionate plots exploring desire between vampires and humans and all of that. So obviously those books are great, but there are other books as well exploring different relationships when it comes to vampires. So I picked 4 books that explore those very different relationships because just like vampires, Valentine's Day is, for me at least, about love. My mom really encouraged that with me and my siblings growing up, that it wasn't just about romantic love, it's about platonic love too. It's about loving your siblings and celebrating love with your siblings and your family and your friends, and things like Valentine's Day that have popped up I feel like really like enforce the fact that Valentine's Day, super great if you have a partner. I really love Valentine's Day though, and I always have, for the fact that it's not just about romantic love, it's about just celebrating everyone that you love. So these 4 books have very different vampire relationships, so let's go through them really quickly before we get into the vlog. This first book is the only truly backlist title that I have for this vlog. A little bit of a wild card, and that would be Fever Dream by George R.R. Martin. The vampire relationship in this one is going to be a very contentious and enemies, I believe. I didn't even know that George R.R. Martin had a vampire book, and when I was looking for different vampire books to read, this popped up. I'm a big fan of Game of Thrones. I've only read the first book, and I'm gonna be honest, I really don't have a desire to prioritize that series just because I have a feeling it's never going to be completed at this point. But a standalone vampire novel, this was written in the 80s. I believe it was written before Game of Thrones actually, so this takes place in 1857. We're following a struggling riverboat captain, and he's approached by a wealthy aristocrat with a too good to be true offer. So I don't know much more about that, but I don't think this has like any romance in it at all. I think the vampire is going to be the enemy here, so we'll see. Reading Fever Dream. The next book that I have for this vlog would be Cutting Teeth by Chandler Baker, and this one follows the relationship between a mother and her child, because this is about, I believe, a series of children who get turned into vampires, and their parents have to decide what to do with them once that change has been completed. How far does a mother's love go for her child? This one says it's part murder mystery, part motherhood manifesto, so got Cutting Teeth. We also have a book that's going to focus on frenemies or friends. I'm not really sure how how this relationship is going to pan out. But American Ghoul by Michelle McGill-Vargas. This is about a woman who has to team up with a vampire to make it from the South, the antebellum South, to the North. Our main character is a black woman and the vampire is a white woman, so both of them not great on their own traveling by themselves, so they team up to try and get from one location to the other, and it's a very self-sabotaging time. This one says that it's part horror, part buddy comedy, so intrigued by this one. And then last but not least, we are picking up a book that is focused on a romantic relationship. That would be A Cruel Thirst by Angela Montoya, and this one is about a fledgling vampire and a headstrong vampire huntress who has to work together against their better judgment to rid the world of monsters and potentially fall in love along the way. This one is billed as a romantasy, so this one less horror, more fantasy. Obviously with the romantasy we have the romance in there, so I am so excited to dive into this vampire vlog, sink my teeth, pun very much intended, into some great vampire fiction. I'm gonna go get to reading. I will check back in with y'all later with the reading update. So I am now on lucky chapter 13 for American Ghoul, and this one's definitely, let me just say right off the bat, heavily leaning into the buddy comedy and not so much horror. There's some horror elements in there, but it's definitely like very strangely comedic. And I say strangely comedic, not that this book is strange in any way, but just horror comedy, so hit or miss for me. I feel like it's hit or miss for a lot of people. Actually, Rachel Harrison does blurb this book on the back, and I think that's maybe a great comp author. Rachel Harrison says it's grimly funny, sharply observed, and entertaining as hell. And Rachel Harrison, I have such a mixed bag when it comes to her books. There's some books that I've DNF'd because I didn't like the horror comedy tone, and then there are other ones that I've really enjoyed. So this one, I don't know, horror comedy is like such a hard thing, I feel like, to get right, because you have to nail like two different things, right? You have to nail the horror elements, and then you also have to nail like the comedic elements. So if the author doesn't have the same sense of humor as you do, or just, you know, the same sense of humor in the book as you do, I don't know how this is going to go. I do like the setup, I just don't know, like I kind of wish it was just a little bit more bleak and less comedic. So we'll have to see where it goes. Chapter 13, I'm 108 pages into this one, but we are following main character Lavinia, and Lavinia is a black woman who was a freed slave. This is right after the Civil War. At the beginning of this book, we find herself still working for her former master because she's really stuck. She doesn't have friends or family. She's very understandably nervous and scared to go up north by herself. That's a long journey for a black woman to make on her own, and she doesn't really know what she would do, where she would go. So for now, she's still working in the same place that she's always worked, but now she gets money and she's no longer enslaved. So that's like a very small solace for her. Her life is still not great. She still deals with a lot of prejudices. One day, a very mysterious woman appears at the front door of her employer's establishment, and this woman is very interesting, and Lavinia learns that this woman is actually a vampire. This vampire, Simone, is very reckless, and it's very clear that she will be found out if she continues traveling by herself. So these two women strike up a bargain and they decide to go up north together. Lavinia needs this white woman to help her, just like help protect her during this very dangerous period of time, and protect her not only because she's a white woman, but also because she's a vampire, and then Lavinia can also help Simone like reel in her recklessness and help her survive as well. So that is the setup, and that setup I feel like makes like a great comedy of errors sketch. This is 300 pages, so I don't know how long like I'm going to enjoy just that concept, because it's very much just that concept right now, is that Simone's very impulsive. Lavinia has to reel her back. Simone does something that makes them have to up and leave and go to a different location. So I'm curious to see how or if that dynamic is going to change. And of course, at the very beginning of this book, we actually find out that Lavinia is in jail because she is accused of killing Simone, and Lavinia is trying to convince her jailer that Simone's not actually dead because Simone's a vampire. So we see her at the very beginning of this say, "Let me tell you a story," and she starts telling her jailer the story of how they met and their adventures leading her up to this point. So I am cautiously optimistic about this one. Like I said, just a little more comedy forward rather than horror forward for me, but I am having a good time with this one so far. And just because I have this as a physical book, I think I'm also going to pick up an audiobook of one of my other books as well. So moving into the weekend, that is the plan. I'm going to be reading this physically, hopefully finish it up within the next couple of days, and also pick out an audiobook. So I'm gonna go get to do that. I'll check back in later with another reading update. So I finished American Ghoul, and this one was just okay for me, like I was suspecting at the first update of this book. Just the blend of horror comedy for this particular story just didn't really work for me. This one obviously does have like some body horror elements if you're familiar with any sort of vampire story, you know, just the way that they have to feed. There's going to be some body horror there, but other than that, this very much leans into the comedy as opposed to the horror. So I think, if not like in terms of plot or anything like that, but I was really reminded of Renfield, that movie that came out a couple years ago now, that I was really intrigued by the premise, and it was another horror comedy involving vampires that just didn't really work for me. But this is another one that just, it was a little too comedic and just not enough horror. But the premise for this one was really intriguing, really original, and I thought it would have been a great short story, or even perhaps like a reoccurring SNL skit, because the setup of our two main characters is an interesting dynamic. We have Lavinia, we have Simone. Simone is a vampire and Lavinia is her ghoul, her Renfield. It's an interesting relationship for sure, and there were some parts in this book where it kind of mentions how Lavinia was enslaved and then she was free but working for her former master, the person who owned her, and then after that she started helping Simone out, and because she was her ghoul, that was a different type of servitude and a different type of power dynamic impacting her freedom. I thought that was interesting. I kind of wished it would have dove more into that. Obviously exploring those dynamics would have made it a lot less comedic, but I thought the commentary on that sort of relationship from Lavinia going between a rock and a hard place in terms of her situation was very fascinating, and I will say this one ends really well. This one really sticks the landing. I enjoyed the way this ended, the way this wrapped up, and while it was kind of a miss for me, I would suggest it to people who maybe are like intrigued by vampires, intrigued by horror, but maybe want something a little more comedic to kind of dip their toes into the horror scene. This, I don't think it's gonna keep you up at night. It's not very scary, and just for me, it just ended up just leaning too much into the comedy, not enough of the horror. The balance there was a little little off, and then just also it just felt a little long. We have a lot of back and forth between Lavinia and Simone, and there were some things that throughout this never really got addressed that I thought were going to get addressed throughout the story, and then just their dynamic and the situations they'd get into and how they'd have to get out of them. It just felt like very repetitive at times. So very interesting premise. Again, if you love horror comedy, you might want to check this out. And I did enjoy like the concept of this one. I thought it was a really intriguing concept. So first book down. And yesterday when I finished this one, when I was deciding on my next book, I wanted to get one that was just a little more horrific, since this one was more on the lighter comedy side. So after finishing American Ghoul, I ended up picking Fever Dream by George R.R. Martin, and this is a very intriguing time so far. So this is actually George R.R. Martin before Game of Thrones, and I think that's very fascinating. This definitely feels like a departure. I've only read the first Game of Thrones book, but I'm really intrigued by this one, and I'm kind of surprised that I am getting along with it so much. I'm about 120 pages into this one, and even though so far they are not alike in any other aspects, American Ghoul and Fever Dream both kind of take place in the same sort of era in American history. This one takes place April 1857, and we are kind of moving from the north to the south because we are following a steamboat captain. So that immediately stood out to me as a synchronicity between these two. When I was picking out this TBR, I was really just going off of what my library had, and I didn't like, now that I'm thinking back on it and the premises, it makes sense that these do take place in America during the 1800s and the same kind of time frame of a couple decades, but I just thought that was interesting to point out. Very, very different vibes here. This one's definitely a Gothic horror. On the back, one of the blurbs says this is for fans of Stephen King and Mark Twain, and I'm a fan of one of those authors, but I definitely see the comparisons because this is very historical horror, and we spent a lot of time learning about like steamboats and that industry. So we are following our main character, Abner Marsh, and he has just had the worst winter in his company. His company is pretty much on the brink of bankruptcy because weather and conditions have destroyed all but one of his steamboats. Now, at the beginning, he gets a very mysterious and intriguing offer by this mysterious gentleman named Joshua York, and York wants to pay Abner a bunch of money to split the profits of his company 50-50. He's offering to back Abner in his steamboat expeditions, and this obviously feels way too good to be true for our main character because he's pretty much destitute, but he doesn't want to look a gift horse in the mouth. So they agree to enter into business together, build a steamboat that's just so big and grandiose. York will fund the entire expedition, and there's just a couple of catches that have to deal with asking no questions about what York wants to do and what business he has in traveling up and down the Mississippi. So we have that dynamic going on. We are also following a group of vampires who live at a plantation together. Their leader is named Damon Julian, and they're pretty despicable vampires. We don't get as many points of view chapters, and I'm like 30% of the way in this one, so that could change. We don't get as many point of view chapters of these vampires, but trigger warnings, like it does get very, very horrific, the things that they do and the vampiric behaviors that they get away with in a state where you can still buy other human beings. So that's definitely a premise that I have read before. Obviously, we were kind of dealing with that a little bit in American Ghoul, like in the antebellum period, and then we also have works like Anne Rice, Interview with a Vampire, and Abraham Lincoln Vampire hunter. I've definitely seen this be explored in vampire fiction before, where we have the slave owners being vampires, because I feel like as a writer, a lot of writers are grappling with the fact, and a lot of people too, grapple with the fact that, okay, these actions that people who bought and sold other people, the actions that they did are so horrific, they couldn't possibly be humans, they had to have been vampires. And using that as kind of a commentary, I do get that reaction. Obviously, the people who owned slaves were not vampires, they were just horrible human monsters. But I have seen that be explored before, and unfortunately in this time period it's very easy to see how a very cruel and sinister vampire could game this system where people already are not being treated like people to run amok. So we're following Marsh and York as they're sailing up and down the Mississippi, and Marsh is trying to figure out what York and his friends, like what they're up to, because they are very mysterious. They only come out at night. They have mysterious business dealings that he is not privy to. And then of course we're also following these despicable vampires doing horrific things to enslaved people. So we're probably going to see these two groups come together in some sort of conflict, but I'm enjoying it. I'm really enjoying it. And this is definitely a slower paced build, and I'm learning a lot. This is definitely, I feel like you have to have some sort of interest in historical fiction during this time period, because we go into a lot of detail about a lot of different aspects about the time, in particular just like the steamboat culture. I'm not gonna lie, when I originally picked this one up and I heard it was going to be about that, I was a little nervous, but I am surprised by how much I'm enjoying this slow build. So I am obviously reading this one physically. I do have the audiobook checked out. I'll be listening to it like when I work out and stuff like that, but I think overall I do prefer the physical experience more. So I am going to go get to reading. I'll check back in later with another reading update. This is going to be a very short update, but I am 70% of the way through Fever Dream, and I'm loving this one so much. The last update that I gave was last night, and I was at 30%, and I'm now at 70% the day after, and I just cannot stop reading this. This is like, I know there's a lot of memes about this, but this was literally my Super Bowl this year. Not that me and my partner normally watch the Super Bowl, but we usually tune in to, I don't know, just usually there's some sort of party going on. We're hanging out with other people, but I was hooked. I was hooked. We didn't have any plans. My partner did still watch a little bit of the Super Bowl, but I was just so engrossed in this one. It's almost 400 pages, and in a lot of respects, this is a very slow moving story, but I can't stop reading it. And I really couldn't tell you why. Like, on paper, this doesn't seem like it would be a story that I would love, but I'm just so engrossed by it. There have been some points in here where certain things came together, certain timelines and different character interactions. There was a moment where I was just so like physically shocked, and that doesn't happen with every single book that I read. So I am going to be finishing this up very soon. I am working today, but during my breaks and all of that, I just am going right back to this book because I'm absolutely loving it. So I am going to finish this one. In my next update, you'll see me wrap up my concluding thoughts, and then I might be picking up another book as well. So yeah, I'll let you know. So I finished Fever Dream, and I had a lot of fun with this one. I had a lot of fun, and this is not a book that, I don't know, maybe fun is not the right word. It's very dark and it's very pessimistic. I think like the grim darkness of it, like George R. R. Martin is kind of known for that, especially with Game of Thrones. So nothing new in this. This isn't like romantic vampires. There's no like cheesy moments. This is historical horror, and it gets so bleak and so gruesome, and there are some horrific scenes in here. This did come out before Game of Thrones, and I definitely think that's interesting to note because you start to see some threads, I feel, that pop up in the Game of Thrones series later on, like some of the character descriptions, some of the character archetypes, and then just George R.R. Martin loves writing about a woman with violet eyes. So those were kind of interesting to see. I felt like there was a lot of politicking in here, which was interesting. The world building was great. It's not as sophisticated as what he will do later on in his later work, but this is a standalone, and I had a great time with it. And I am just so pleasantly surprised by this one. I will say, you know, if you have no interest in historical fiction whatsoever, I don't know how much you'd get along with this one, because just like in his series, his fantasy later on, he loves to describe a world, describe even down to the minutia of little tiny things in this world. So if you do not care anything about this time in American history, or even just like the steamboat history and subculture, you might not like this one. Although I will say, I wouldn't have said that I was interested in like steamboat culture and the workings of the steamboat industry, but I found myself so gripped, so you never know. Yeah, this one was very horrific. The title Fever Dream for this one, I do want to point out that it is the name of the boat. The Fever Dream is the name of a boat. This does not read like a fever dream. There's another book that I do love named Fever Dream that reads like a fever dream, and this one is not. This one is not that. The Fever Dream is the name of the boat, and the boat is so integral in such an interesting way to this story, but wanted to point that out. This definitely doesn't have like a fever dream feel, so if you're wondering if it does based on the title, that is just the name of the boat. The vampires in here are horrific. Other men in here do horrific things as well. George R.R. Martin he's very ruthless about killing his darlings. So even though we do have vampires who are more immune to being killed and having their lives ended, there's not a lot of plot armor for any single character in this book. It's tense the whole time. The slow creeping build of this one really works for the story, and the things that these vampires do are horrific, and the way that they talk about people, in particular Black people, enslaved people, are absolutely despicable. I do think it's important to note that the language that these vampires use to talk about humans is the language that people who owned other people used to describe Black people during this time. And there's a quote that I really find illustrates this on page 127 in my edition, and that is one of the vampires talking, saying, "It is nothing. All these things the cattle make fall into ruin. I have seen Rome itself turn to dust. Only we go on." The vampires are talking about humans as cattle, as nothing more than livestock, which is very upsetting to read from, and in a historical context, interesting to see that parallel being used, talking about vampires, thinking about people this way, and of course, real people during this time in American history, talking about other people this way. So that's really, it's really dark, so just know going in, it is historical horror, feels very true to the time period, unfortunately, just with a lot of the ways in which there's a lot of inequity in society, to put it very lightly. And honestly, this book does make me want to pick up a Song of Ice and Fire series, but it's not that I didn't like it. I read the first book of Game of Thrones a number of years ago, but just I have so many series that I want to read, and I do want to prioritize them that are already finished. Now, I do know obviously the show is finished, so I do get a conclusion to the story, but not a conclusion to the story that's in book form. So yeah, I had a lot of fun with this one. Before I move on from talking about this book, the main relationship in here, this book actually deals a lot with a male business partnership that turns into a really strong friendship. So I would say, without spoilers, there's obviously vampires as enemy, vampires as an evil in society, but there are also relationships in this book that are super integral, that are about business partnerships, but that aren't actually partnerships. It's one of those situations where you're like, no, we're co-workers, we work together, but then at the end of the day, the friendship that two characters in this book have, I think, is just a really beautiful depiction of a strong male friendship. So enjoyed this one. However, the last two books that I've read for this vlog, definitely very historical. So for the next book, we are going to move into the modern day a little bit. So I'm going to be picking up Cutting Teeth. This is by Chandler Baker. I can't wait to read about blood-sucking little kids. As you can tell from the lighting scenario, or maybe you can't because it seems like I'm filming this in the middle of the night. I am not. It's actually about 11 a.m. It's just such a dark and stormy day, so a perfect day to get some reading in. So I'm going to go read some of Cutting Teeth. I'll check back in with y'all later. So I am now about 40% of the way through Cutting Teeth by Chandler Baker, and I'm enjoying it so far. It's a very fast-paced, twisty-turny thriller, and it is taking place in a very idyllic suburb. We are following three mothers, Darby, Rhea, and Mary Beth, who are all mom friends, and they all have very different views on motherhood and parenting, but they are friends, they're connected. They each have a 4-year-old who is in the same exact class at the Little Academy preschool. However, trouble starts from the prologue, from chapter 1 of this book, as a teacher at the academy is brutally murdered at school, and it seems like the only witnesses are the 4-year-olds. That, of course, has the town very much on edge, but as we follow Darby and Mary Beth and Rhea, we are seeing that this death, you know, there were some things happening before this murder happened that may or may not be relevant, and just some secrets and other things, other secrets and other scandals coming out of the woodwork because of this murder. And then we also have the added element of all of these students, or at least most of them, and it's growing by the day, a lot of these precious little angelic 4-year-olds are developing a taste and a thirst for blood. So this is almost like, this is kind of like Big Little Lies-y meets vampires. I love the context of adding in like something a little bit paranormal and the hints of these little tiny kids potentially being enmeshed in this murder. Potentially, we don't know yet, and it's very interesting following the three different mothers as their children are experiencing this thirst and kind of seeing like how they're grappling with that and what they think their duty is as a mother to support these children, protect these children through these very bloodthirsty times. So this one definitely a little bit shorter, but I really like it. Every single chapter we have some mysteries that are kind of, you get a little bit of an answer, but then you get another question. So lots are going on within the lives of these three women, not just having to deal with their children who may or may not be vampires or turning into something with a thirst for blood. So I really like the way this is going. This one definitely has like some comedic moments, like some satirical moments and some satirical lines. However, this isn't, I wouldn't necessarily say it's a comedy. It's a pretty dark book, and it's definitely reading like a straightforward suburban thriller, just with, you know, just a hint of satire here or there as we talk about like the impossibility that society puts on mothers to be the perfect mother. So I am really enjoying this so far. I'll definitely be finishing it up today because it is very speedy, very fast paced. It is Valentine's Day Eve, so not really a whole lot to do today, but tomorrow me and my partner are going to see the new Captain America. Fingers crossed that we enjoy it because I've been very hit or miss on Marvel lately. I did really love the Falcon and the Winter Soldier though, so I do have high hopes maybe for this one. So we'll be doing that tomorrow, but today's plan's going to finish up Cutting Teeth, and then I'm also going to be starting A Cruel Thirst by Angela Montoya, and that is that fantasy romance between a vampire and a vampire hunter. I just think it's fitting to have saved the romance for Valentine's Day Eve and Valentine's Day. So I am gonna go get to reading those books. I will check back in tomorrow with a reading update. Happy Valentine's Day, friends. I know this video comes out after Valentine's, so I hope you all had a great day no matter how you chose to spend it. Last night I did finish Cutting Teeth by Chandler Baker, and I did really enjoy this one overall. I will say, out of all the books so far, this is the least paranormal. The things that are happening with the children, it feels like very rooted in science and not necessarily like vampires. There's a lot of like blood sucking going on and mothers giving their children blood, but that's used more as like commentary about the ceaseless sacrifices of being a mother. So the kids are not undead. I don't think that's a spoiler because this book was marketed, I remember when it came out, as little kid vampires, and it's not like vampires per se, but there are some like creepy little kid behaviors. So I do still think it fit really nicely within this vlog. This one definitely, I would say, if you are intrigued by vampires, maybe you only read literary fiction or thrillers or just anything that's contemporary, if you only read from those genres, but maybe around Halloween you want to read something that has just a dash of something that's not even paranormal, but just something a little more out of the ordinary, a little dash of horror, I think you could really enjoy this one. I had a fun time. It was a very twisty and turny thriller, and it didn't overstay its welcome. It was very short, fast-paced. There were definitely some things that I was able to pick up and guess, and then there were other things that I was shocked by. So I had a great time reading this one. I thought the premise of if your child develops a taste for blood, how far would you go to help them as a mother? I thought that was really interesting and really like made this thriller stand out from other domestic thrillers that I've read in the past. So enjoyed that one. And then last night I also picked up A Cruel Thirst. This one's a romance, so it's definitely a great read for Valentine's Day. I'm about 30% of the way through this one and I'm enjoying it. I'm also a little bit cautious just based on some of the things, some of the tropes that are in this one. So we are following two main characters. We are following Lalo, who is hunting for the vampire who killed his parents. However, this is chapter 1, so not spoilers. This is setting up the entire story. Lalo goes to take his revenge, and the vampire ends up turning him into a vampire. So now his quest for revenge got a whole lot more complicated because he is now a vampire. He is something that he wanted to destroy, and he is setting out to try and figure out how to destroy vampires, specifically the vampire who turned him. We are also following Carolina, and she is from a family of vampire hunters. However, because she is the only daughter, her father does not let her train with her brothers, but she trains in secret. It is her dream to make her family proud and to live a life where she she is a vampire huntress, and she wants that for herself. She wants to be in the family business, as it were, and she is very constrained by her father wanting to marry her off, not wanting her to be a part of the vampire hunting. These two cross paths as Lalo is on his journey, his hunt to figure out how to kill the vampire who sired him, and they have to overcome a lot of prejudices towards each other to wipe out this common enemy that they both share. So that is the premise. The fantasy part of this comes from the vampire elements. It feels very rooted in our reality. The vampires are the only fantastical elements in this one, so definitely adjusting my expectations based on that. And then this is a very romance heavy fantasy romance. I obviously knew that going in, that this was a fantasy romance, and this is also a YA fantasy romance. So I knew that setup. I knew it was going to be very romance heavy. However, at this point in time, like 30% of the way in, I am nervous because we're not getting like the questy elements and the search for the specific vampire elements. We're getting just a whole lot of insta love, and that's kind of a bummer to me, just because, you know, I feel like insta love, I can accept it sometimes in fantasy. I can accept it if it's done well in fantasy. However, for this particular setup where we have a vampire and a vampire hunter, like they are very clearly enemies, so enemies to lovers, like for me it takes a long time to build that relationship up and make it seem like it could be an actual relationship that would last the test of time. It just doesn't feel very realistic to me that the first time these two like lock eyes, they are obsessed with the other, and of course they're like, oh, he's a vampire, she's a vampire hunter, this can't work. But their internal monologue is so insta-lovey, and I just feel like there needs to be more of a slow burn, more tension, more angst, because these two should not be together just based on that premise. So it's a little insta-lovey for me, honestly. Whatever, it's okay. It's Valentine's Day, we're going out of my comfort zone, we're reading something a little more romantic, but I do struggle with that. And then also I am really intrigued by the vampire lore in this one. I think that mythology and the vampire origin story is really interesting. I hope we get more of that, but right now very romance forward. At this point I'm hoping that we get started on the quest and the fight against the shared evil sometime soon. There's a lot of swooning and not enough like angst for me. Obviously it's a fantasy romance, there's going to be romance, but I just wish that it just wasn't so instantaneous. It was a little bit more of a slow burn. Things that I am liking about this though, Lalo is a vampire, yes, but he is a similar age of Carolina. He just got turned, so it's not like it's some centuries old vampire coming after a teen girl in a lot of YA vampire books. So I like that they are on equal footing when it comes to their actual ages. And then I also like that Lalo is just a very like sensitive main character. He's very bookish, he's very sweet, a little bit awkward, I feel like, and no shade to this because I can appreciate this in a book as well, but I feel like the fantasy romance, the big archetype that we're seeing like really predominantly in the fantasy romance genre is like shadow daddies or big dark brooding characters, and Lalo is not. He's very much, he's a sweetheart. So I do really like those elements. So I am going to keep on reading this one, hoping that as this progresses we're going to get more of the mythology and more of the quest elements and have the romance like hopefully not proceed like at a breakneck pace, maybe slow down a little bit, add some more angst, some more tension, some more slow burn. So I am going to keep on reading. I'll check back in later with another reading update. So I finished A Cruel Thirst, and overall I had a good time with it. Like I mentioned in my first update, it was just a little bit too insta-lovey for my particular tastes, but I thought it was a really enjoyable Valentine's Day read. Especially, I don't tend to read a ton of romance, but I really enjoyed this one. It was fast-paced, and Carolina and Lalo were really engaging characters, and even though I did think it was a little bit insta-lovey, they were like a cute couple to root for, and they were good characters to root for. There's a side romance that's pretty cute in here as well, and the latter 50% did go a little bit more into the different mythologies and different aspects of lore. So overall, this was an enjoyable read. It feels like a very stereotypical YA paranormal romance in the aspects where if you are craving reading that subgenre, this is a great book to pick up. You'll have those story beats, those character arcs that you're really going to enjoy, and I thought this book did a really good job of kind of subverting some of the things that have been done before in especially paranormal YA romance that I don't tend to typically like. I especially liked the character of Lalo and how he was a recently turned vampire, and that made it just a lot less creepy that he was pursuing Carolina. So I did enjoy this one. Vampire hunter romance with some action and a whole lot of romance. I definitely would recommend this to people who like a YA romance and who like a paranormal story and who also like a marriage of convenience trope. So that being said, I read 4 pretty good books this week. This is why I love doing vampire vlogs, because I know I'm not going to get bogged down in one specific story that all feels the same. These 4 books had very different tones and subgenres and ways in which they approached vampires, so I had a lot of fun. Of course, we had our romantic vampires with A Cruel Thirst. This one is, you know, for people who love a YA paranormal romance. This is definitely vampires as a love interest, vampires as a dangerous love interest, but also a love interest that is very alluring. And then of course with American Ghoul, we have a frenemies, a contentious friendship with that vampire and ghoul relationship between our 2 main characters. This one I would recommend for people who are trying to get into horror, because this does have horrific elements, but almost in like a cozy horror sort of way. If you're a cozy mystery person, I think you could like this one. If you love a horror comedy, and if comedy and books really work well for you, in particular in the horror genre, I think you could have a lot of fun with American Ghoul. We explored the love of a mother and her child in Cutting Teeth. This one I would recommend for people who want a vampire story, who don't really love a paranormal story, but maybe just want a seasonal thriller. This takes place during the school year, so September, October. If you're primarily a contemporary person or you read a lot of thrillers and you just want something a little bit more creepy for spooky season, this would be a good vampire adjacent tale to sink your teeth into. And then last but not least, we do have Fever Dream, and this one is for people who like a slow gothic historical horror. This one is definitely very gruesome and horrific. There are scenes in here that there's one, including a baby, that I will never be able to get out of my head. If you've read George R. R. Martin's Game of Thrones series, you kind of understand the stakes of this one, in that no character feels safe and he's not afraid to get rid of people horrifically. So this one I wouldn't recommend as like an introduction to horror, but if you have read horror before, if you are looking for very gritty and horrible vampires, then I would pick this one up. This one also though had a great friendship between 2 of our main characters that I really enjoyed. So overall, I had a really great reading week. This vlog was definitely a success. Now it's time to go grab dinner, grab a movie with my partner. I hope y'all had a very happy Valentine's Day. If you enjoyed this video, video, please be sure to give it a thumbs up, leave a comment down below, subscribe to my channel so you don't miss content from me. Stay safe, stay spooky, and I will see y'all in the next video. Bye!